Hello, everyone. My name is Tadas Vinokur. Welcome to Flickr Theory Reviews podcast, where we are going to discuss Israel-Palestine conflict. This conflict has been a stalemate for years. However, in the aftermath of recent events, relocation of U.S. embassy and Palestinian protests, we are forced to look at this issue critically. I myself have been surprised by the way media was covering this sequence of events. Sometimes it really feels like any discussion of peace is a thing of the past. Israeli supporters like Jonathan Russo blame Palestinians for not engaging in peaceful protests and instead constantly using the murder card by forcing young martyrs to attack and then act and to attack Israelis and then act devastated when they're killed. Palestinian supporters think that the relocation of U.S. embassy has killed stone dead any remaining hopes of peace and a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. Today, I would like to discuss possible trajectories towards peace and elaborate on the situation that the region is in right now. My interest would be to allow the listener to make his own mind after listening to this podcast. Most importantly, I would like to invite everyone to analyze the history and, by extension, critically approach the possible future where both nations can live together. Joining me today, I have my dear friend, Alfred Yun. So maybe, Alfred, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, Tadas. It's great to see you. So my name is Alfred. I studied philosophy at Randolph College. That's kind of why Tadas and then I also attended Berklee College of Music with Tadas. So there was like mutual interest in many ways. So we've talked a lot about various kinds of politics, and we also tend to like talking about those things as well. So we've talked about it a lot, and just like Tadas said, recent the conflict between the Israeli state and Palestinian protesters sparked again my interest. Or I would, interest makes it sound like it's like a hobby, but like vested interest in talking about something that actually I'm an American citizen. That me as an American, I am actively a part of. U.S. is not just a bystander in that way. So that and I think it's a thing we should keep thinking about. And I think the reason why we wanted to do this is that there is this part, and I think we'll get to this later, is that often people talk about a two-state solution, and according to perhaps the 1967 borders, to some people it's 1948. It depends on who you talk to, but most people I think are talking about the Oslo Accords. But there was also people like Edward Said, who's a great hero of mine, and he's a very important intellectual. He was talking about a one-state solution, and not in the sense of like just an Israeli state or just a Palestinian state, but more of a binational state where everyone is a citizen, everyone has equal rights, which I think is almost unthinkable back then in 1999 when he wrote the essay, and even right now it's pretty much unthinkable when I talk to people. But I think it has some elements that it's not applicable just to Palestine and Israel, but I'm also a Korean citizen and a person of Korean descent. It's also important to the Korean conflict and perhaps many other areas as well. And that's why I think I just wanted to talk about this issue, particularly within the context of Israel and Palestine, because that's where first I've heard of it. But I think hopefully maybe by thinking about how it applies to Israel and Palestine, we can think about how the radical theory that is needed to achieve that feat could be applied to elsewhere too. So that's
I feel the same way. Probably because I was myself raised in a Jewish environment. My dad is Jewish, and he's actually a very famous political commentator in Lithuania, and he supports Israeli very vehemently. And I think when we were discussing this issue, I always kept asking him what can he do as a person who had Israeli citizenship, and what can I do as a person that supports Israeli culture? What can we do from our perspective and from our position to sort of embrace a peace project of some kind? And I feel at this point, looking at the political spectrum, and considering that I'm not sure even if Dershowitz is still, maybe he's still for the peace, but he's way on the right. He's giving interviews for Fox. and he says that it's not that I changed, but the liberals have changed. But anyway, I just wanted to emphasize from the way I see it, really the discussion, the spectrum has shifted to the right, and very very banal, even very obvious discussions about the peace have been rendered passé. And so this is something that I would like to sort of really fix today in one way or another.
Yeah. And I think that's another thing is that in some ways, I think in this context and in many others, is that peace, not just peace in the sense of we live separately, because that's not peace. That's you're not living. Peace was something that happens when you live together with the person you didn't want to be peaceful with, right? So in a way, that's why I think that's one of the reasons I have a problem with the two-state solution, is that ultimately what it means is it's not peace in one sense. There isn't war, hopefully, but I think even realistically speaking, the 1967 did not last for a reason, I think, because Israel wants an Israeli state for Jews themselves over the entire land. And Palestinians, rightfully so, believe they are entitled to that land because they've been living there. That's their land. You know, and I think, but that, and just living separately with that ideal in mind cannot lead to peace, because even if you're not at war, you're not living with each other. You're living without each other. So there's no peace in that sense either.
Exactly.
So I think in order to actually achieve peace, we have to learn to live with each other. And that's, I think, what is so radical about peace. And and that's what I mean by peace, I think.
So from here, I think we could just go into like this brief discussion of the history of the conflict and see what is it that we're talking about. And I'm going to want to emphasize the fact that that the people there are living together, and both were doing incredible mistakes throughout this process. And this implies that some of the things that are like distancing those two nations from each other, like religion or the claim over the region or whatever, these are peripheral issues, and we have to discuss about two nations making deliberate attempts to find a resolution to this issue. And so let's just jump right into it. And I think it would be appropriate for us to kind of like begin with Ottoman Empire, which controlled this region when Zionism, the modern Zionism, has began, and so in 1897, Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in the Swiss town of Basel. So that was like the beginning of the modern Zionism. But the idea was always that from amongst the Zionists at that point, the idea was that the Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. And as one of the Zionists, Ahad Ham, who was one of the first ones who actually went there and saw whether this is a land without people, they quickly realized that, as Ahad Ham himself said, if a time comes when our people in Palestine develop so that in a small or great measure they push out the native inhabitants, they notice that there are native inhabitants there, this will not give up their peace easily. And this is a sort of foreshadowing the history, the future of this conflict, because they notice then, like the people who actually were in Palestine, they notice that there are people who live there, and it's not just a land without a people for a people without land, and it's not going to be as easy as just relocating that, which is I think an important also discussion, since sometimes, for example, Hitchens always critiqued the messianic Jewish state idea. He said that it's an absurd idea. It doesn't compare its claim over the land to the other people's claim over the land, but we're not. I'm not necessarily saying that for example, Arabs or Jewish people lack credibility or legitimacy over like the claim to the land, but I'm saying that both of all those claims have to be negotiated equally. What do you think about that, Alfred?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, and especially talking about it at this point, is that every single one of these people have been living there for decades.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, and I think there was a quote, I forgot who was talking about it, but when you've been living there with your family for generations at this point, and someone tells you to get out of that land, especially with something like a land with historical importance for both Palestinians and Israeli, they're not just going to leave. Like it's just, you don't just leave that kind of land.
Yeah.
You're not like, all right, I'm cool. Like I'm going to Cuba or like, you're not like, I'm going to Hawaii. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, I mean, that's why, that it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And another thing that, and I think this is more related to what you were talking about with the beginning of the settlement and the eventual occupation and conquest of Palestine that happened with British and U.S. support, is that from the get-go it was about evicting the Palestinians from their land, and from the get-go it was always about excluding the other.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's a really big problem that was started from the beginning, is instead of living with the other, they were trying to exclude the other from the beginning, and that ultimately leads to just, utter destruction all the time, as we've seen throughout history. And I think that's one of the big problems that right now Israeli people have to grapple with, like a lot of white people do in this country still, and all,
So, and here, I think we can go into discussion of the nationalist movements within the Palestinian state or the Israeli state, because when we were discussing Ottoman Empire, there was no such thing as Palestinians, and Palestinians really as a term and as a identity, it became a thing as a reaction to settlements, as a reaction to British power. And it's one of those. That's one of the reasons why people like Prime Minister Golda Meir can say stuff like, "When was there an independent Palestinian people with a Palestinian state? It was not as though there was a Palestinian people considering itself as Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country away from them. They did not exist." And this is, I think, important to kind of emphasize, because every nationalist identity is sort of a reaction to the circumstances that are changing, geopolitical circumstances, strategic circumstances. So, for example, Palestinians as people, they became congruent as a reaction to British and settlement procedures. But Zionism itself also became a thing when they noticed that there's anti-Semitism in Europe, and they need to renegotiate their own nationalist identity and come up with this nationalist agenda that was Zionism. And so I think both of those perspectives are, both nationalist perspectives are there for a reason, and maybe for a good reason, maybe for a bad reason. But for example, I would like to just critique like people who continue saying that there was no Palestinian people throughout history. There was, no real modern Zionism before it actually, came into being.
Yeah. And I think that's a very interesting point, because actually in an essay that Edward Said wrote about, and I think I have the quote right here: Palestinians or what was it? Palestine is multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious.
Yeah.
There is as little historical justification for homogeneity. So, and Edward Said was talking about, and this is in the context of a paragraph where he talks about how Palestine has always been ethnically diverse, has always been a diverse group of people. And that shows, and then you talked about the historical process of nationalization, and I also think it's racialization. It's very similar to the act, and it's, especially if you look at the way conservative politicians in Israel refer to Arab people with racial slurs and stuff like that. There is a racialization process as well, is that they're chunking this heterogeneous group of people into this homogeneous race of Palestinians for the purpose of Zionism, which is also a racialized entity that was imposed upon, as a reaction to the racialization that Europe did against the Jewish identity, which is diverse.
Yeah.
And so I think and I think that's and then part of, because it's racialization, that allows the racialized identity, the other, not the race that I belong to, but the other race, as people who don't deserve certain things like land, or things that I have, which you see even with like white supremacy, right? Is that I deserve this country, not you. Mexicans, get out of this country, right? Like it's pretty similar, and I think it just reflects the racialization process that took place from the beginning.
And so I would just, now we have an opportunity to complicate even more what you said. So the First World War happens, 1914 to 18, and it was a very transformative event in the history of modern Middle East. And we know Picot and Sykes' agreement in 1916, where they divided the Middle East into countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. And and ultimately, British had they were granted sort of the mandate over the Palestine, and so we immediately come into a discussion of colonial sort of interest, and just it's interesting to note that for a colonial power like British, there was no really need to be altruistic about their intentions. They had clear interests in the region. For example, so they wanted to protect their own interests, and they were trying to balance their interest with others' interest in the best way possible. But obviously, it would be problematic in many respects. So how do you think, for example, the introduction of imperial colonial power into this, for example, discussion? How does it complicate the overall discussion of the racialization and peace process of the region?
Well, I think it inevitably brings in an element we didn't talk about, which is capitalism, and and there are a lot of things like that, and that's just been the story of the Middle East. So not only is it a racialized issue, because look at the way we still talk about Arab people when they come to this country, but also there's vested, like for example, the British were. A lot of the British and the U.S. interventions, for example, in Iran or other countries, were about oil as well and natural resources, and that's one of the reasons why you have this coalition with Saudi Arabia as opposed to Iran, because Iran is is the one with natural resources that the U.S. doesn't want, and accordingly, that kind of translates into the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well, and that's one of the reasons why the British and then the U.S. Have this relationship with Israel, and is the reason why the U.S. is investing or pouring in the most foreign aid to Israel. It's not just a religious issue. It's also capitalism. It's also imperialism. It's also racial. But religion is a part of it too, because it's also. I think I read a very striking thing where they talked about how right now the biggest donors and the biggest lobbying money that's poured into pro-Israeli policies are not Jews, actually, or not Jews, but white, far-right, Christian evangelicals in America, throughout the whole world. That's the biggest lobbying for pro-Israeli causes. So that's that can't just be explained away with capitalism. Also, I think there's elements of that too. Capitalism had to, mold the evangelical throughout American history. I think that's a big history as well. But that's all part of the whole picture, and I think that's, and I think it definitely complicates it. but gets us closer to the truth, I guess.
Yeah,
By
exactly.
talking about,
And
yeah.
it's as I said, like the powers, for example, the colonial powers are always looking for their own interests. So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
where the British, they were interested in they wanted to secure the route to India. For them, it was like the most
Yeah.
important part. After its
Mm-hmm.
opening in 1869, the Suez Canal, which for them was like a vein that supported them and gave them economic energy, sort of. And also they wanted to preserve territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire because they wanted to guard the whole region from Russian expansionism.
Yeah.
And and so therefore they started making these deals that were that it were sort of like trying to sit on two chairs at once. So for example, Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, made promises to Sharif Hussein, the Hashemite ruler of Hijaz region of Arabia, about the creation of independent Arab kingdom. Britain officially recognized the long-standing claims of her French allies to Syria, while staking claims of her own. And also gave promises to Zionist leaders in London. And so they were trying to like sort of satisfy all these different players within the game,
Yeah.
and ultimately, and we can talk a little bit about a Balfour Declaration in 1917, where where they say, the British say, that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Of the three sets of commitments, Britain, that's one of the three sets of commitments Britain made over this much promised land. But we also have to note that at that point, the minority of Jewish settlers, not settlers, but even the people who were there all along, was really minuscule. And I think that sometimes people who talk about, so for example, late Ottoman period, or you can go back to late Ottoman period, Jewish citizens at that point made up 3% of the population of Palestine region. So that's Muslim citizens were 86 to 87%, Christian citizens 9%, and 3%, like in total 15,000 Jewish people. And okay, so demographics, I think I have demographics with like during the British rule. I think the Jewish element of the population numbers were 76,000 compared to, and the whole Palestine was 700,000. So you can do the math yourself, but it was so at that point, even the Balfour Declaration, which meant that that the British government is want to establish a national home for Jewish people, was viewed by Arabs as a big concession, as a big gift, as a tremendous gift to Jewish people, and here we sort of are approaching this, what Israeli supporters are often describe as Palestinian rejectionism, because they kept rejecting all these deals, and they're blamed for doing that, and some people say that if they had accepted, for example, in 23, if they went into Council of the League of Nations, they would have been able to present themselves, and then later on, UN Resolution 242, or after 67th war, they would have been able to actually participate within that as a nation more concretely, and they would have been able to gain more land, but at that point, I mean, it's what do you think about those decisions, the rejections?
Wow.
Do you think there's would you like sort of expect from like from Arabs to sort of understand that their rejection is going to lead to their loss at that point, because they were expecting
No.
like they were like 100% they were expecting to get a better deal in the future, you know.
Yeah, yeah. No, I don't think it was reasonable, and they couldn't have predicted World War II and
Yeah,
its aftermath. So like, there was no way they're gonna know all that. So like, yeah, I just don't think it was. Yeah, it makes no sense. Like they're literally like 3% at one point, and I think even right before 1948, there were only about 7% Jewish people in Palestine. So that's a really tiny amount, and suddenly you're just going to give like 50% of your country to these people. Like I don't think they were none of these were going through their heads like it made any sense. But I think what's really interesting about this whole population aspect is that that's, I think, the key difference between, and I think that's why the one-state solution for Palestine and Israel is so it's been there from the beginning. It's screaming from the beginning is that the difference between, for example, Native Americans or First Nation people and the Americas is that in this large land, the United States and Canada succeeded in eradicating all of them, like pretty much every single person.
Mm-hmm.
And you really don't have to see any of them in the United States. That's the most sinister part of it. But in Israel and Palestine, there are 3 million people total, and I think 3.5 million Palestinians living in Israel and Gaza combined in that tiny piece of land. Like they're going to bump into them all the time. And it was much, and in the disparity, and it was much, and that's right now after so many Israeli citizens have been created. Whereas, since the beginning, the Palestinians have been outnumbering Israelis for quite a while, and then now, things have changed. But even now, there are millions of them, right, living literally like 10 minutes away from where you're living. And that's a very different dynamic. And I think that shows you the untenability of the kind of, just settler colonial model that worked in the United States. I mean, not worked in the good sense, but like
Mm-hmm.
there, there was no I think it was tenable for the colonizers side in that sense. Like the United States, like the white settlers who came to the United States, they succeeded in what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Israel from the beginning, because they were always the smaller minority, it was never going to succeed in the way they wanted to. I think it's showing from the beginning because there aren't that many Jews to begin with, whereas an entire continent of white people can pretty much take over an entire continent of Native Americans, so there were enough people to populate the whole continent. So I think that is another aspect that I think is still relevant to right now, is that, and I think there was no reason from the Arabs' point of view to like really, there was no reason they could anticipate. I mean, if they looked at what's going on right now, maybe they would have been like, wait, maybe that would have been maybe we should have taken that. But I just don't think there was any way they could have predicted World War II and so many of the things that happened, or the U.S. becoming such a big player later. Yeah.
And so we can after Balfour Declaration, there were a lot of a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Zionists were kind of disappointed, and there were very serious processes of lobbyism happening in London. And for example, in '36, Palestine erupted in demonstrations because they were really, disappointed with the whole lobbyism campaign in London, because and the most important part of that, what annoyed Arabs, was that Zionism was very in a very close relationship with the European power, and ultimately the Peel's Commission report was published in July 1937 after those demonstrations, because they wanted to put together a new map proposing new boundaries for a reconstructed Palestine, and really, if we look at the map, Peel Commission map, I'll put it on the screen while during the video, and we can see that a proposed Jewish state is really small here compared to like the current maps. Proposed Arab state is it takes up it takes up Gaza, Ramallah, Nablus, all those regions, the whole West Bank, the whole Gaza, the whole region towards Red Sea, and but after this was proposed, Arabs again they rejected it, and so again we have this sort of a chain of events that led to continuous rejections of the deal, which is obviously as you enumerate. I mean, it's we cannot possibly. It would be kind of like naive to assume that they would have known how, and especially if they were to know what's going to happen with the Second World War, with the Holocaust, and the fact that 6 million Jewish people were killed, massacred, and obviously international community all of a sudden was all in favor of Jewish state. Obviously, if they were to know that, it would have changed a lot of things, a lot of decisions. And we can also a little bit discuss for example, 1947 UN Plan, Resolution 181, Future Government of Palestine, which proposed the partitioning of the unitary state of Palestine into two countries, one Jewish and one Arab, and the establishment of a special international regime over the Jerusalem area and its religious sites. And I think just to maybe emphasize the fact that the regime over Jerusalem is something that we're going to be discussing the present state of the regime over the Jerusalem, what that entails. But for example, in Resolution 181 and later resolutions, it was always assumed that Jerusalem should be kept international city because there's a lot of Jerusalem is controlled by Arabs and Palestinians and they themselves at this point they would still probably claim Jerusalem to be their own capital city.
So I think you talked about how we couldn't really predict what, and I think that's true. They couldn't really predict what was happening, but I think there are markers though that we could look at, especially because that's the thing is that we have now we're living in 2018, where we have the scholarship of post-colonial studies and studies on race, and also we've lived through the Nazi era, and we've had better studying and more honest studying of what happened in the Americas and what happened during the Atlantic slave trade and stuff like that. That gives us a better picture of how to look at the seeds of, of a racial identity or a nation state that does lead to, the kinds of things that happen with the great, some people call it the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, what happened with the 1948, where hundreds of thousands of people were, basically forced out of their homes by Israel. And I think that even though back then, even if the land is a small amount, in that if given power because of the idea of exclusivity, and especially if it were funded by a colonial power that thrives on such exclusivity, like the U.S. or Britain, I guess if you look at it like that, it was inevitable.
Yeah.
But it wasn't something they could have foreseen at the time. But I think from looking at things retrospectively, in some ways, I think it was like a lot of the seeds were planted there. Is that the sense of exclusivity, and then the sense of desperation, I guess, from the Holocaust, and also the funding of that project by the U.S. and Britain and colonial powers, how that would lead to something like this. I think, retrospectively we could look at.
Yeah, and it's a really tragic event to an extent, and people always mention it because, for example, the 1947 UN plan was was really very fortunate plan for Palestinians. Like from if we look at the map right now, and but Arabs rejected the plan vehemently, and they also at this point they also indicated that they would reject any other plan of partition, and but the important part is that Arabs at that point lacked representation in
Yeah.
and the assumption is that, coming again from all these commentators, that if Palestinians had accepted the UN 47 partition plan, if they had accepted 37 Peel Commission, if they were not to reject the 1923 Legislative Assembly, they would have had a better opportunities. But but I think we can also here at this point we can like sort of discuss the like maybe the importance, because Zionism was a clear-cut agenda, and even though at this point when they were sending settlements, which are in Hebrew called aliyot, were sending settlements into the region, they were still a minority, but they had a very clearly defined idea of what the state is going to look like, and that's different from the Arab people that were living at that region at that point. And it's an unfortunate fact, because obviously people who have an idea of how they're going to structure this, and people who are trying to fight the settlements and fight the colonial powers and fight the Europeans who are putting these people here and just taking over, they have to be united, and unity is something that it can be created as a reaction to all these movements, and it became a reaction as people started considering themselves as Palestinian, as people who can but at the same time the importance of that, but I'm not really sure whether like Jewish could have done something about it, or Arabs could have done something about it. It's just like the set of events that were not in Palestinian favor, really.
Yeah, and I think a really interesting aspect of this whole thing is that Zionism was never that big until a certain point in history. It's always been a minority. It's never been that big, as I understand it, a part of Jewish identity. But then it was kind of, I think, it took on a greater importance because of the colonial and other reasons we've talked about. But that puts Jewish people at a weird place, because these very people abandoned them.
Mm-hmm.
But the state that these people are helping to create is based on a kind of racialization that these people who abandoned them created for them, right?
Yeah.
That is lumping all of the Jewish people into the Zionist identity, and I guess and I think it's a very very strange thing that happened not just to Palestinians but to Jewish people themselves, and I think and I think in order to understand that, we really have to understand just the complicated and often arbitrary nature in which racialization occurs, and shifts based on power, history, and all these things. And I think that's another thing, is that, and I've talked to a friend of mine who's she's Jewish, and she's talked to me a lot about how sometimes she doesn't feel like she is a minority, and in many ways she's not in the U. She lives in the United States, and that the people, the so-called white people of Europe rejected, ended up taking up a white role in some of the ways, right? And that acted in their favor of rejecting the Arabs who were not white, right? And then there was that dynamic as well. And I think it's just a very strange place for the Jewish people to be in too, is that they're in some ways being assimilated to white supremacy, but they were just not so long ago rejected. And I just think it's a very, very I think it's sinister too, the way it all happens, and I think it's a very, very strange thing.
Just looking at what happened after 1947, Jews were happy about the plan, and Arabs were bitterly protesting, and the situation it quickly deteriorated into a civil war, and here we have these two words, Nakba and Atzmaut, and Atzmaut means Independence Day for Israel, which they declared in 1948, and Nakba is a it's a terrible happening for Palestinian people because the civil war meant that approximately 750,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes.
Yeah.
It was an unimaginable catastrophe, and it's called Al Nakba. That became synonymous with their dispossession and really expulsion from the land of their ancestors. And it's interesting how at the same time, like the such a such an opposite reaction. One side is really glorifying the day of independence, Atzmaut, and the other side is grieving because the Nakba, the utmost terror has happened, and this really kind of like in a sense summarizes the historical trajectory, because in many cases, because for example the Palestinians, a lot of Palestinians leaders at that point were fighting against each other. The representatives were not clearly defined. They were in this position, and it's just a sad position because the joy of one nation constitutes the terror of the other. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have to so that sort of summarizes even like the today's issue, because we have the spectacle of the relocation of the U.S. embassy, right?
Yeah.
And that spectacle is at expense, and really, we're talking about even we'll talk about this later, but I'm just gonna say that, like, for example, people from the democratic establishment, they're talking about how, well, maybe the relocation is good, but at least Trump could have said something about what the peace is going to look like. I mean, even that thing, maybe it could have been just for kicks, Well, maybe peace is going to look like this. Nobody even like paid any attention to that. Nobody even like said something like some sort of a tidbit just for the sake of it.
Yeah.
Just like big spectacle, and yeah.
Yeah, that's another thing that it reminds me of is, you're talking about how the leadership was not, clearly defined.
Yeah.
But they had to be defined because of the conflicts that happened. And you talked about earlier how Palestine was, the Palestinian identity as we think of it now was really constructed, right, through reaction to the events. And that made me, and I think there are of course many differences between Palestinians and black people and their suffering, but I think there's similarity in the sense that black people were literally constructed like Africans of all different kinds. They were not black people. There were very many people that were just living in their own place. But then through the construction of race and Atlantic slavery and whatnot, they were constructed as black people, and black people started identifying as black people, and their struggle, and through their struggle and their identity, that became in a way a legitimate identity, right? And now it definitely is. Now there's a unique thing called black suffering, and I think I think there's an uncanny similarity and parallel to the way that Palestinian identity was created, is that through struggle and through reaction to the conflicts that happened, that these disparate people became this constructed identity, and it shows you the very binary way these things are imposed onto people.
Yeah.
But through that they have lost something. I think.
Yeah.
Is that, and it's not their fault, but they've lost the diversity, the ability to live with different people, recognizing them as different,
Right.
not as the same.
Yeah.
That was lost in Palestinian history, and I think that's the part that Edward Said is really lamenting about in many of his talks about the one-state solution. Yeah, I think it's a very, and I think in many ways it's that way with Black Americans as well. They've lost being able to just be Africans, different kinds of Africans, and now they're all black, and that was kind of lost in their history as well. Yeah, and I think hopefully this conflict we don't push it so far to the, so that there is no reconcilable peace prospect. And yeah, I think, but the odds are looking pretty bleak. Is the truth.
Yeah, and now we can quickly discuss, for example, UN Security Council Resolution 242, because this is something that people, it's still something that always occupies everybody's discussion when we're talking about the peace, because it's the example that was kind of positioned in place. And we're talking about the war of 1967 to 87, 6 days. Israel's defeat of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the span of 6 days. Israel was able to quadruple the amount of territory held, and including Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, West Bank, and Gaza. The 67 war provided with territorial assets that created new opportunities for negotiations. And potentially, led. They thought that might lead to historic reconciliation with Arab neighbors. But so what Security Council Resolution 242 means and what it represents? It affirms that the fulfillment of charter it affirms withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. So after the war happened, they wanted Israel to withdraw from those occupied territories, and termination of all claims of or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area. Well, anyway, so it defined the sort of the territory and the map that we're looking at when we're talking about some two-state solution right now. We're talking about the map after Israel is giving back the land that it took over after the war of 67. So I think this is a very important, and I would really maybe everyone who's listening, I would just ask you to maybe Google that and see the map for yourself, because I think it really I think when I was before I learned something about this conflict, the moment that kind of shifted my perspective was when I actually saw the maps and I looked at it very critically, because I really doubt that most people that are talking about this issue are familiar with the maps. And I think it's important to just be sort of even in cartographic way, cognizant of what's happening, because these issues water, food supply, economic, economic relationship with other countries or whatever, those are defined by bureaucratic decisions, and bureaucratic decisions are based within the map or geographic lines that are put together by people who negotiate these. And it's really important to know who is benefiting from one solution to separate the state from the other, and the other solution to separate one state from the other.
That's a great point, because often I have a lot of people in my own life who talk about this. And 1967 is really kind of the paradigm-defining moment in this whole conflict, because we're still talking about the two-state solution is from that. Really, that's most people are talking about. That's what everyone is talking about, and that's where everyone's talking point begins too. Everyone's like, Israel was invaded, or stuff like that. But so a lot of people tell me this too, and they're in America, and mostly Americans. They're like, Israel was invaded, and this is what, and that's why all of this is justified. But then I'm like, have you seen the map? Is that defense? Is that what you call defense from an invasion? Just look at the map, and no one can answer me, because it's just right in front of you. You can't really. And I think that's and in some ways, the map is very uncanny, because it reveals to me, it's almost like the psyche of Zionism is just enacting it as like a cell.
Yeah.
It's like you're looking at like like a cell eating another cell or something. It's like a very uncanny picture I see. And there's a lot of evidence that, Israel, that this is actually what the Israeli state wanted. So I was reading a book by Noam Chomsky. He wrote a series of essays, and he talks about how he founded recent Israeli scholarship. So he's talking about like in 2006 and stuff like that when this book was written, that Israel's goal in 1967 conquest was to drive refugees into the Sinai Peninsula, and if feasible, the rest of the population too. And then he also found that expulsions during 1967 were ordered by General, I don't know how to say his name right, but Yeshayahu Gavish. He was the commander of IDF Southern Command.
Right.
And they resorted to all kinds of means to prevent those people they expelled from returning, which was in direct violation of the UN Security Council orders. And Israeli politicians from the Labour Party and both the Conservative Party talked about how they wanted to be rid of the Arabs and keep Gaza. That's a very good strategy. They talked about, as if, and they were also changing the maps in 1967 so that, and they were expunging the Green Line, which is the internationally recognized border, and those are disappearing from maps.
Right.
So, and to me, that just basically described, that expresses the mindset that was going on in 1967. That it was not, they were not really just defending from an invading force. This was about takeover, and it's been that way since the beginning. But I think 1967 it was a physical manifestation of that in a way that we haven't seen.
And it's sort
on the maps,
and it's symbolized by, like, for example, the Arab reaction to this. In the conference held at the end of August 1967 at Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, Arab leaders, as Dershowitz always refers to this, issued 3 no's: no recognition, no negotiation, no peace with Israel after the 1967 war. But most importantly, Israel itself, with its such a overwhelming military superiority at that point, Israel was not in a hurry to initiate talks about peace. And for their part, like, for example, Arab countries were not prepared to negotiate from a position of weakness. So there's some sort of like deadlock, which is like a terrible deadlock that puts like both of these nations in a sort of in a plane of a hierarchy, and both of them cannot do anything better. Just like they both kind of like reciprocate each other. The weakness doesn't allow Arabs to engage with like reasonable like concession. And Israel is already, I mean, they're superior, and they're not in a hurry. I mean, they are not in a hurry to initiate talks. They don't need that.
And I think another paradigm defining aspect of this is after 1967, and is when and actually, I mean, even before, but this is when, and around this time, I guess, not exactly 1916, but around this time is when we're talking about the U.S. now.
Yeah.
We're not talking about Britain anymore. Britain died during World War II. That's pretty much what happened. Britain died in World War II, and the U.S. took over everything, basically. And that's what we're really talking about from, and I guess, 1948 was that way too. But 1967, this is when we're talking about more official U.S. involvements in the sense of like vetoing UN Security Council. So I think that this was happening in the 70s in reaction to after the conflict in 1967. That's when we see more official movements from the U.S. rather than just implicitly supporting these things. Whereas now the U.S. is just more openly supporting and making a stance on this issue in the global stage at the UN. And I think that's another really big aspect of this whole thing, is that since then it's really been a U.S.-Israeli driven thing that has been almost unbeatable in the UN Security Council. and stuff like that. Yeah, so I think that's another big part, if I'm being correct.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
So we can go on maybe to discuss also the first Palestinian Intifada. It was followed the failure of diplomatic efforts in the wake of 1982 Lebanon War, and it really like sort of put back into the spotlight the conflict itself.
Yeah.
And it was like Intifada was a a huge, a tremendous expression of depth of Palestinian nationalism, and at that point, this Intifada really empowered Arafat, who later we're gonna probably discuss when we're gonna be discussing Clinton's. Clinton's undertaking to negotiate a peace. So Arafat, Intifada forced and empowered the Arafat leadership to develop new strategies based on two-state solution. And at that point, PLO leaders, Palestinian Liberation Organization leaders, already agreed with a 242 and a two-state solution, and we are heading towards the 1993 Oslo Accords with that were when in which happened in Norway, Oslo. These were secret talks by Israeli and Palestinian dignitaries, and later on they were invited. All of them were invited to by President Bill Clinton to sign these accords on the White House lawn. And but really, at this point, we can also talk about the fact that compared to, for example, the first Camp David talks in 1978, which sketched out the phased approach to Palestinian autonomy that was kind of consistent and had timetable. The main difference from Oslo was that Oslo provided for formal mutual recognition between the PLO and Israel, and it didn't really. It sort of negotiated space, like Oslo Accords negotiated the space wherein later on, like more bureaucratic, more detailed decisions are going to take place, and so declaration. So one of the things the declaration calls for is that Israel has to withdraw from Jericho and Gaza, and eventually from the West Bank. 5 years of limited autonomy for Palestinians in those areas has to be granted. Election of Palestinian Legislative Council within 9 months. Establishment of a Palestinian police force. The question of Jerusalem was still left undecided. And so Oslo agreements are very important to the extent that this was perceived to be Bill Clinton's huge, a deed that was supposed to like really strengthen the peace project. But it really, at the end, we're going to discuss it went in shambles, and it didn't do much for both nations, and which is and again we are going to have to discuss like the dynamics within the negotiating next to the negotiating table because people were blamed for being arrogant, people were blamed for not conceding enough and whatever. But again, the Oslo is something. Again, I would like invite all the listeners to just also Google Oslo Accords, because it's also something that was always. It's also very often mentioned when we're talking about the peace project of today, because Oslo Accords were seen as a big achievement of by Bill Clinton, even though it did not follow through at the end.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting, and I think that's how we were talking about Korea in
Yeah.
the beginning, and Bill Clinton was also doing things with North Korea at the same time. Bill Clinton was trying to resolve two conflicts, and it's kind of similar to what's going on in right now with Trump. Is that Trump is trying to deal with North Korea while he's not trying to pursue peace, but deal with Iran, whatever that means, in his own way. And I think that's and in that way, I think the 1993 Oslo Accords really defines at least the space of U.S. foreign policy, the kind of space that it occurs, where it's you deal with the Middle East and you deal with this other nuclear power in the East, and that was, I think it's another show. And Bill Clinton, I think, was one of the persons to really pursue the more modern approach, because before Bill Clinton, with Bush and particularly Reagan, it wasn't really about Asia and the Middle East that much. It was like Latin America. You had Russia, or at that time the Soviet Union. So it was a very different kind of, and then Israel was part of that dynamic. Whereas since 1993, you really see the dynamic between, now it's more of China, North Korea, and the Middle East, whereas the Latin America and the Soviet Union don't matter as much anymore. And I think that's that's the shift that occurred, and Bill Clinton was trying to do his take on that as he was defining it, on how to achieve peace on his own terms. And interestingly, both his negotiation with North Korea and Israel and Palestine failed. Ultimately, it didn't last. And I think in some ways that's a very interesting parallel between the two. And I think another point that shows, you talked about the power dynamics, is just looking at things like water supply that was negotiated during the Oslo Accords. So there were, according to the Oslo Accords, they created two desalination plants, one in Israel and another one in Khan Yunis, which is south of Gaza. But for the one in Khan Yunis, I don't know how to say the name right, but instead of seawater, they used underground water because it was a cheaper process. But using underground water to desalinate degrades the aquifer, and it guarantees severe problems in the future. And the UN Relief and Works Agency later, after they've studied this for decades, said that through these measures and many others, damage to the aquifer would be irreversible. Gaza may be unlivable by 2020. And I think that kind of reflects the kind of mindset that was going on in the Oslo Accords, is that instead of creating something that was ultimately sustainable, I think they were trying to just put something there. And then I think part of the problem, at least from my point of view, is the separate and the disproportionate power dynamic, and the notion of exclusivity that's baked into all these talks, that I think ultimately leads to something very unsustainable, like the water supply that's in Gaza. And I think that
and as I said, Oslo Accords they didn't say anything serious about like the complex issues such as borders and status of Palestinian state, the claims and repatriation of the Palestinian refugees, and the fate of the Jewish settlements, and the disposition of East Jerusalem. And repatriation of the Palestinian refugees is something that is really important, because if we're talking about peace solution, we're gonna have to talk about demographics, and the right of return is something that is like it's a very polemic issue. People still try to like negotiate whether it's a reasonable way to go or not, and that was not discussed, for example, in the Oslo Accords. And both of the sides at that point were against it. Israeli extremists were against it because they saw it as a security risk, but not just that, the extremists saw it as an abandonment of God's mandate. And really at that point, now we're approaching 96 elections in Israel, and because there were a lot of terrorist attacks, Netanyahu was elected as the Mr. Security, and his platform was basically defined as one that should slow down the peace process. That's Netanyahu, which is the prime minister of today, and and we have to ask the question: if Likud is the party to make the peace happen, if the conditions, if the environment would sort of create, if Palestinians come up with a deal, it's probably not a great deal, but a deal nonetheless. Would Likud party would they step up and actually do something about it, and actually would enforce that deal? This is the question that we also have to answer today, because, for example, in '96, Netanyahu ran on a very clearly defined agenda, which was that the slowing down of peace process is a crucial thing to do. We could discuss quickly Camp David II, where Clinton, Arafat, and Barak spent a couple of weeks in July 2000. They were trying to end, they were again trying to end the conflict, and again, this 2-week conference ended in anger and frustration. Barak's arrogant negotiating style was blamed, and Israeli negotiators were angered because by the unwillingness of the Palestinian side to respond with counter proposals. But according during this plan, what Clinton was saying, that the Palestinians would build their state on 94% of the occupied territories. So everyone should look up the maps and see for themselves. In return for Israel annexing 6% of occupied land, and we actually didn't really. I just came to my mind that we didn't talk a lot about settlements, illegal settlements in West Bank and Gaza, and so why they are talking about the 6% that should be annexed by Israel. Because the premise was that probably at that point it would be impossible for Israel to just get rid of settlements, at least 100% of settlements. So they would have to annex pieces of the occupied land, which obviously complicates the whole situation, because then the contiguity of Palestinian state is at risk. And that's one of the reasons why we are so frustrated with the peace dialogue right now, because really a lot of people think that two-state solution is think of the past, or is an unrealistic thing. Some people still uphold it. Some people still glorify it, but at the end of the day, we know always that it's at risk. It's at great risk.
Yeah, and I mean, if you just look at the map of this supposed solution that two-state solution is going to have, how are the two parts of Palestine going to interact? They're going to have to interact with Israel in the end, and Israel continues to be the country of Likud. Then that's going to breed conflict in the end. Like, there's no way out of this, and there's no way out of this without conflict. As long as Israel and Palestine, and particularly, I mean, for me, I think Israel is the one that really needs to change the way it looks at Palestinians as human beings. But also Palestinians, their national identity, I think, does get in the way of living together. And the settlements, I think, is another clear example of that. And it's very paradoxical, is that through their desire and their moves to create an exclusive or Jewish state, they inevitably become more and more they interact more and more with Palestine by creating settlements.
Yeah.
So the only way to be an exclusive state is to be more like Palestine, is to get to take more of Palestine. And that's just inherently contradictory and paradoxical at heart, I think. And that's why I think inherently the two-state solution will always breed conflict.
Right.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's my yeah.
And so the negotiations continued in Taba, where where Israelis and Palestinians held marathon meetings, but it kind of all of this was undermined by Ariel Sharon's provocative visit to Al Haram al Sharif, the site of in East Jerusalem, on which stands the golden dome of the Rock and the Al Aqsa Mosque, which is an important piece of religious artifact for Arabs, and it really sort of kind of I would draw an analogy with the spectacle of the provocative spectacle of the Trump, relocating the U.S. embassy and again what happened with Ariel Sharon after the Taba negotiations, because it immediately undermined everything. You really have to wonder if that was it was not a deliberate attempt to undermine the negotiations. Because it was a provocative, symbolic gesture that clearly and inevitably led to violence.
But anyways, what was it? So another thing that I think it really maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think one of the things that I keep thinking about is how just how similar the dialogue in the United States, particularly, which is where I live right now, and which a lot of influence it has over this whole conflict, is how the way they talk about Hamas is very similar to the way they talk about, for example, any kind of Arab group. It doesn't even have to be a terrorist group. It can just be Iran, which is a country, and I think that's and I think that's a very dangerous thing that's happening in this country, and I think that's that's just been on my head.
Yeah,
But anyways,
and maybe so we finally are getting to. I mean, obviously, our discussion of the history was kind of really brief, and we were trying to save some time. But I mean, we were. I myself was really trying to be objective towards it, and obviously, I'm open to any kind of critique from listeners or from anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And but again, well, we're now in the 2000s, and Saudi Arabia proposed a peace plan that came to be known as the Arab Peace Initiative when it received unanimous, actually, approval of the Arab League meeting in Beirut. It promised Israel that in return for the full withdrawal from all occupied territory, Israel would receive regional recognition and its relations with Arab world would be normalized, which is something that political scientists at I send you the article. It's on my tongue, or whatever. But the people who were a lot of political scientists thought that this is going to be really an emancipatory event, because Saudi Arabia proposed a peace plan, and there's a clearly defined trajectory for the peace. And in June 2009, in widely anticipated speech, Barack Obama underlined again the United States endorsement of the two-state solution. And we could also talk just a little bit about Barack Obama, because he was neither there nor here, and at the end of his term as a president, he was hated by probably most of the pro-Israelis, and which is, but really, what do you feel about? What do you think about, for example, Obama's work on the peace settlement?
Well, I think right before we talk about Obama, I think I want to slightly go back to because I think it sets up the stage for Obama and why he was so drastically different in some ways. So in 2006, Palestine elected Hamas,
Yeah,
right? And that there was a big um, lash, or there was a big reaction from Israel and the U.S. where they tried to set up a coup, and that didn't work. So there were attacks, and that killed a lot of Palestinians. And
yeah,
that's what happened 2 years before Barack Obama, right? And then Barack Obama came in, and things were slightly different. And that's also pretty much been Barack Obama's foreign policy across in general, is that he was opening up. So, and I think that's the important thing, is that this whole conflict, particularly in the modern day that we talk about, is the Israeli-Saudi Arabian alliance and the Iranian, Russia, and all these other
yeah,
countries that are aligned. And what Obama did was he opened up dialogue with Iran, so he couldn't just be so heavily on Israel's side anymore
yeah,
because he was trying to negotiate and have the Iran nuclear deal with Iran. And it wasn't just Iran, it was actually just generally Obama. He was doing this with Cuba, he was opening up talks with Cuba. And unlike Bush, his relationship with North Korea as well was kind of not quite there, as you were
yeah,
describing. It was not as hands on as George Bush wanted to be.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that pretty much defined Obama. But that shows again that the pro-Israeli side, what they want is U.S. to be on their back,
Mhm.
pushing for everything that they're doing. And yeah, and Obama um, was not that person. For 8 years, he was doing that. Even though I wouldn't describe him as not being against Israel, because he was for Israel, just not in the way that Bush was,
Mhm.
or Trump is right now. And I think that's a very strange moment in history, because he's just this in between thing that happened while right after Bush, and then we have Trump. So in between, there's just this Obama phase of Iran nuclear deals and opening up trade with Cuba and being pretty okay with North Korea. That just kind of happened for 8 years, and then Trump happened, which where we're living in right now. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting and unique period
I mean, I think
in
that from
U.S.
like
foreign policy.
our from the perspective of today and what's been happening in the region, I feel like Obama's probably political decisions are really under they're critiqued to such extent that I think we really have to kind of like at this point we really have to come back to that like sort of a gradual like sort of I think reasonable and maybe politically correct approach to these issues because
Yeah, yeah,
clearly the destruction of the Iran deal and such spectacles as U.S. Embassy relocation. I mean, uh, I'm afraid that they might be caustic to Israel itself and in America more than it is like beneficial to both of these countries.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah, I mean, and we're talking about nuclear weapons
Yeah,
ultimately is what we're talking about, and that's another thing is that behind all of this talk about peace in Palestine and Israel and that's why I don't think it's ultimately just a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, even though Palestinian suffering should be always talked about and put in the forefront, is that ultimately is a humanitarian crisis, is that Israel has rejected nuclear inspection for decades while they're trying to crack down on Iran's their desire to enrich uranium, and that's pretty scary. I think,
hmm
especially in the very conflicted region that Israel occupies, and that it is leading the conflict. That's a pretty scary ordeal to be in, and that is another specter that's hovering over Israel and other nations around it, and that's ultimately, I think, why in another sense, there's just a shared fate, not just with Israel and Palestine, but also with countries like Egypt, is that once a nuclear conflict ensues, they're all screwed.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And I guess in that sense, it brings me to North Korea and South Korea, which is, I think, another, because as a Korean person, I think there's a lot of connection between Korea's and Israel and Palestine in that respect, and that shapes particularly the way the South reacts to the North. This is kind of what I think this whole Israel-Palestinian conflict needs, is something like a South Korea where they can have, you know, it's not where there is someone who recognizes that there is a shared fate, that they're not in such desperation of a national recognition like Palestinians to the point that they just anything they're just so desperate, right? Palestinians, they're literally starving to death. They're not in the place of South Korea where they have a more secure sense of national identity. They don't have to be so, crazy about, or I don't like the word crazy, but very so desperate about their national identity that that they have to keep trying to assert it with every conflict.
Yeah.
Whereas South Korea, because it's not in that place, it recognizes this shared fate that North and South have. They're literally like Pyongyang and Seoul is like about an hour or two away from each other. A nuclear conflict happens, we're all fucked. That's just, and also there's more and that's the difference between Palestine and Israel. And then the difference is that for Israel and Palestine, they're more connected than North Korea and South Korea are at the moment. But North Korea and South Korea, because of the DMZ and stuff like that, they're more separated. But despite that, the connection that just comes with living in the same land, speaking the same language, and sharing much of your history in South Korea and North Korea, I think it's much longer.
Yeah.
That creates this kind of outlook that becomes a shared Korea, shared land. And I think in Palestine and Israel, some things are more hopeless because of the power dynamic, but in some ways it's more hopeful than even North and South, which things are going pretty well right now, because in some ways they cannot be closed off from each other the way that North and South are.
Yeah.
They're
intertwined properly.
Yeah. They're just so intertwined. Yeah, they're in some ways they're more connected than North and South Korea.
Yeah.
So,
and I feel like you touched upon a very important point, is that sometimes when I have discussions with my colleagues or my friends about Palestine and Israel, I mean, Israel, there are a lot of Arab states that don't necessarily like Israel's presence in that region. But we're talking about America's support. What that means is cultural superiority. It means financial superiority, economic superiority, military superiority. Israel, I'm not sure if it's affirmed, if not affirmed, but it's supposed to have nuclear bombs. We're talking about a power that really nobody would like to mess around with at this point.
Yeah.
And so really have to sort of redefine the dialogue before you get into it, because you have to understand that if Iran is feeling like committing a suicide, then but if they're not feeling like committing a suicide, then they're gonna act according to international decisions. It's just a matter of fact.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna go back to my spiel. On 2012, General Assembly recognized the Palestinian state, and reaffirming also relevant Security Council resolutions, including resolutions 242, 338, and it recalled advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of July 2004. Recalling also the Arab Peace Initiative that I talked about just a couple of minutes ago, adopted in March 2002 by the Council of the League of Arab States, reaffirming its commitment in accordance with international law to the two-state solution of an independent, sovereign, democratic, viable, and contiguous state, which is also really important. So Israel would retain in this case sovereignty over many Jewish settlements close to the Green Line. Palestinians would gain sovereignty over Arab neighborhoods, and a shared regime would provide both sides with unimpeded access to their respective holy places. So all this means, again, that we really kind of familiar with the two-state solution. The parameters of the two-state solution are well known and well rehearsed, and yet the prospects for the two-state solution are, as we talked about, are fading and they're undermined by hardliners. And these have some quotes from Prime Minister Israeli prime ministers. Ehud Olmert warned that the coming demographic parity of Arabs and Jews in the land of historic Palestine would necessarily carry the danger of forcing Israel to become an apartheid-like state. In 2010, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak echoed the diagnosis. If and as long as between the Jordan and the sea there is only one political entity named Israel, it will end up being either non-Jewish or non-democratic. If the Palestinians vote in elections, it is a binational state, and if they don't, it's an apartheid state.
Yeah.
And at this point, I was interested in looking at what kind of coverage we are getting from the media today.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, let's begin, for example, with New York Times. In the New York Times editorial, which was posted on May 14th, on Israel's mass murder of 62 unarmed Palestinians on May 14, it takes the editorial takes for granted that dividing historic Palestine into two states along ethnic lines is the answer, criticizing successive right-wing Israeli governments for expanding Jewish settlements in the West Bank and or on land Palestinians expected to be part of. Well, anyway, it's granted that two-state solution is the solution that we have to go for.
Yeah.
Independent, also editorial board and Independent, they write, Israel has killed the decision to move its embassy in Israel to Jerusalem has killed stone dead any remaining hopes of peace and a two-state solution between Israel and Palestinians. And I have some articles from Washington Post, from Wall Street Journal, but what I'm trying to say is that two-state solution is something that, sort of at least the liberal establishment that is, still quite reasonable or quite cautious. That's the only solution that they're talking about. Even though a lot of leftists and even a lot of people on the right, actually, which was also really interesting. I'm probably going to be able to pull that up and check it out myself again. But they also talk about one-state solution. But for example, Likud Party officials, they talk about one-state solution because they want to annex the whole thing. But I'm not really sure what they're going to do with demographics. They're just probably going to kick the people out. But they're in favor of one-state solution, which is interesting.
That's the interesting thing is that I think on the right they're more talking about a different kind of one state. And they're not really talking about the one state that we're talking about. They're talking about something else. It's a one state, but not necessarily what we're talking about. Yeah. It's a scary state.
Here, Likud MK Tzipi Hataveli. She's part of the Likud party. I think she's a member of the parliament, Knesset. Argued that Jordan was originally created as the Arab state in the British Mandate of Palestine, and that Israel should annex the West Bank as a historic part of the land of Israel. Naftali Bennett, leader of the Jewish Home Party, also argues for the annexation of Zone C of the West Bank. Which is as we talked about, where it doesn't say where they're gonna put all the people living.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
They're talking about a one state, but they're talking about something else, something entirely different. They're not talking about something.
What do you think about the issue? And here I talk about this, and with my father. He's really a most probably prominent commentator here in Lithuania on this issue. At least people would respect him. So we talked about this, and he immediately told me one-state solution is impossible because Jewish people are never going to go for it, never, because that means that that's not going to be a Jewish state anymore because of demographics. Because
that's true. Yeah.
So,
I think
what do you think? Would you? I mean, from us being all nihilistic and atheistic and all hateful of everything religious and enchanted, we would likely, would enjoy seeing, some sort of a. No, I'm joking, obviously. But
yeah,
do you
yeah, yeah.
think? Do you think it's something that can be avoided, or is something that needs to be avoided, like as an issue, the demographics? I mean, obviously, that would be a civil rights movement that would have to happen, and
Yeah, yeah.
obviously, Arabs would have to attain rights, and obviously, they would have to be represented in a
Yeah.
parliament. And what does that mean if they're the majority? They you know, the decisions
Yeah,
are
yeah.
going to be
No,
rather different for the Jewish state.
I I think some of the answers lie in all the things we've talked about. In that the big problem is that you're like, I mean, your father's right. Right now, it's not like the conversation with the way things are going. Yeah, they're not going to accept a two-state solution or a one-state solution because I mean the liberal media reflects that too. Is that no one thinks it's going to happen. But I think the difference is that, but it's not impossible.
Yeah,
And the difference, I think, what my point is that it is what needs to happen.
yeah,
Is that everything else is going to lead to disaster in the end. And also, there are some clues we can, I mean, and it's not like this is unthinkable. It's just unthinkable in the current context if you're trying to just make it happen with a snap. But I think there are small steps that could be taken. Is that changing the dialogue within Israel and how they look at Palestinian people as human beings, not as Arabs, not as racial slurs, not as this thing that they want to get rid of, but to start talking about Palestinians as human beings. And when you start talking about people as human beings, you can live with them, right?
yeah,
And then these are not just any human beings you can live with. These are people who've been living with you already. You're just now recognizing that they've been living with you, suffering, but they've been living with you. And I think that's the first step, is to get rid of the racialization and to talk about them as human beings, as people they actually live with and they have more in connection with than any of us who are living outside of that region. That
hmm,
so once they start realizing that, I think that's another path. And I think another path is for the U.S. to get the fuck out, or to like to put it more mildly, to like stop doing the things that Trump is
yeah,
doing, basically, And I think that's one other thing. And yeah, and I think that's where it begins, is for the Israelis to start looking at, and that's another thing that's really similar, is that there's a very prominent North Korean refugee who's in Korea right now. He's talking a lot about human rights and North Korean reunification. Is that he talks about how, in the case of North Korea and South Korea, the big problem that needs to be changed is for South Koreans to start thinking about North Koreans differently. It's on the South Koreans to really think about things differently. And I think it's similar for the Israelis, is that it's the Israelis who need to start looking at Palestinians differently, to stop looking at them with antipathy, because the Palestinians are literally starving with no water. You
hmm,
can, like, that's not a place to be to asking them to, start calling you brother or anything like that. Whereas
right,
I think the Israelis, they're in a better place to do that. And another thing is, I guess another crucial part is to put the Palestinians in a place where they are not so desperate. So every decision they make is not out of desperation.
yeah,
That's another place to be. So they can be more like South Korea, recognizing, to be in a place where they can recognize things that maybe conflict might even lead to a nuclear conflict if Israel really does have nuclear weapons. So I think those are the three pieces that I can think about.
well,
And I think
actually,
we've
I think well, I just opened the Times of Israel. They talk about the poll that was just taken. 41% of Israelis want to ease restrictions on Gaza. Most
yeah.
Israelis satisfied with PM's Prime Minister handling of the latest flare-up of violence with Hamas, but still believe the government could do more to avert another war. And so I think I would make the conjecture that Americans probably feel the same way. I mean,
Yeah.
even as I said, like Friedman, who was in, in Barack Obama's office, Thomas Friedman, he obviously he talks about how Gaza had to basically go to the fence of Israel carrying olive branch in one hand and in the other, just basically apologizing for everything and whatever. But at the same time, he said that at least Trump or they had to at least sort of entertain the possibility of peace and what that would look like, because it's really unclear. I just read yesterday Scaramucci's. I have it here as well. I think Scaramucci's. I think he's out of the office already, right?
I think so.
Yeah. But he's like, so he's in support of one state solution, but he doesn't really. If I have the article here, I could actually show it to you. Scaramucci. Oh yeah. Speaking at Arutz, Scaramucci said, one of the greatest things about well, anyway, I'm a believer here. I'm a believer in a one-state solution, not a two-state solution. The only reason why I'm for a one-state solution has to do with the security. At the end of the day, you're never going to be able to have a two-state solution if one state is a sponsor of terrorism and a sponsor of murder. It's just not going to happen, no matter how idealistic you are. So again, like, what does that mean?
It's kind of different, but in some ways he's hitting on what we're talking about. We're looking at it differently, but yeah, I mean, in some ways I think he's right. Perhaps, maybe I don't think the who's the terrorist, I think, is the difference.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But in some ways I think he's hitting on the same thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think...
what else did I want to... there were some couple of articles. I think it's assumed. I read a couple of articles. It's assumed that most of the Trump's advisors are in favor of two-state solution, because it's just something that is probably at this point a soundbite that they have to put there, right?
Yeah,
but really, again, the recent events proved that both parties are interested in status quo, and what Chomsky calls the idea of greater Israel that is gonna sort of crawl into the region, and in a way that is not allowed, and where this is going to lead is just just a question that we're going to have to answer as people that are interested in peace in the region.
And hope, and maybe because I'm not someone who, my father is actually a political scientist and a professor too. He's he's an expert on East Asian conflicts more than Israel and Palestine, but I'm not an expert like him on knowing what are perhaps the actual policy decisions, that individual things that people would make to solve these conflicts. But I think we as outsiders, what we can do, and we as human beings, what we can do is, and I think is what we need, and I think I'm right, is that perhaps what we need is, policies are important too, but also to look what it means to be a human being and how we interact in the kind of how we think of each other as human beings. And I guess, it brings me back to Judith Butler's article I think I talked about in the beginning, how we are always having to deal with each other, and how that applies even in this conflict, and that when you try to not recognize the other, as Israel is doing, it leads to paradoxical conclusions that is ultimately unresolvable. Like, you cannot resolve the Zionist quest, because ultimately what it ends up being, what it can only yield is to make Jews the privileged class in Israel, right?
Yeah.
But that's unsatisfactory, because what Jews want is to be rid of them, is to just have a Jewish state. But that you cannot do that.
Yeah.
That's like, you cannot kill every single person or evacuate every single. That's just not possible. Even if you create another state right next to you, because it's literally right next to you, and they've been living in your land already to begin with. So it's just not going to happen. So in the end, it's paradoxical, and I think perhaps that's why I was interested in this whole issue and talking about it to begin with, is to talk about is to start thinking about, to read history and to think about how we can look to live radically differently as human beings.
Right.
Yeah, that's.
What are your thoughts about, like, for example, uh, corruption and extremism in both places. What do you think are like the causes of it? And like obviously, for
Uh,
example, I just read Finkelstein's comment, and he's talking about
yeah,
how
Norman Peoples.
Saudi Arabia is really just playing with you know, Palestinian leadership. They do as they ask them to do, and everything is really, you know, corrupt. And there's a lot of in Hamas. Let's be honest. There's a lot of extremists that really, you know, as they unequivocally say, they would like to not have Israel over there. But obviously there are places, even in Likud, in the parties, in the party manifesto, it's written that there's not going to be any kind of a state, but Israel
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
the region. So uh, I think
Well, the thing with
I think the discussion that I'm interested most is like the expectation of democratic processes in the in Palestinian region. Whether it's what kind of attitude do you expect Palestinian people to have towards democratic processes
Palestinians.
in that region?
Well,
Because like
I think
from a lot of like pro Israelis, obviously it's like they got a chance, they blew it, and now they have to prove to all of us that they're democratic, and then something is going to happen. Well, the question is if from point of view of Israel, something is going to happen if they follow through, the Palestinians. That's one of the those are one of the questions, and also can democracy thrive if the conditions are so poor,
yeah.
right?
Well, I think I think I first want to touch on Hamas. Is
Yeah,
that I understand why it's disturbing for Jewish people when Hamas says things like
yeah,
that, because literally not so long ago something like that did happen to them. But Hamas also recently, their charter, they got rid of that
yeah,
from their
yeah,
charter, and they've been talking for decades that that part of their charter back then is not something you should take seriously. So Hamas has never been as extreme as people portray them to be. There are definitely unsavory elements, but it's so like, and Hamas, I think, is just a response to like what is happening in, like, when you're a starved nation with humiliated with no dignity and integrity, you know, your responses are not always going to be the most that is diplomatically savvy,
yeah, yeah.
as I put it. And another thing is that Palestinians are quite democratic in some ways. They democratically elected Hamas.
Yeah,
So
something that
like,
is
that's
forgotten
not
in
talk. Yeah,
2005.
I
Yeah,
mean, because yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that people don't like the outcome of that
yeah,
democratic process, so they like to deny the democratic idea. But it was a legitimately democratic process that happened when they elected Hamas. So I think Palestinians are more democratic than people think.
hmm,
But I think the biggest problem with Palestine is not really a problem of tactics at this point. You can't have tactics when you're starving. So I
yeah,
think the big problem with Palestine is to regain human dignity with water and food, and I think
exactly.
that's what needs to happen first, and then we can hopefully work with and talk to Palestinians about maybe the Israelis are not just your enemy; they're also people who live right next to you,
Yeah,
and you probably have to deal with. Maybe you can deal with that differently. Maybe we can talk to them about that. And some Palestinians, I think the younger generation, we can talk to them about that. But I don't know. I think I don't want to put too much of an onus on people who are starving. I think that's how I look at it. Is that there is a responsibility and they play a role, and it's not just a one way street with Israel.
it's yeah.
But given the circumstances, I think at the moment we have to ask for Israel more since it has more power, etc. So
And to the
that's my
extent to like, for example, you as an American and me as a person that was, you know, I was brought up in a Jewish culture.
Mhm.
That's Israel is something that we can do more, you know, about
Yeah.
their policy. You can vote, for example, in American elections. You can force your
Hmm.
representatives to sort of uh, negotiate peace process. You can do
Yeah.
those things, and you're responsible for
Hmm.
that, and that's your role. Your role is not, for example, to like really patronize Palestinians or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's really important, and especially for like people who are that consider themselves intellectuals. I mean, really, you're not doing anybody favors when you're like walking, working with like for example, Trump's Trump's decisions, and if you really support them, I mean, really there has to be more fruitful dialogue in place, and really that's I think everybody's role would be that to just sort of like render that dialogue more fruitful. And I just wanted to kind of like add this, like maybe we're probably approaching the end. It's been like already
it's been a
it's
while.
been a while. But I kind of, if we are approaching end, I would like to end on a sad note. European Union warned Thursday evening in response of the advancement of plans for 1,958 settler homes this week. These developments, alongside a number of other related actions taken in recent months, seriously undermine the viability of a negotiated two-state solution. And so, really, they're talking about the fact that Netanyahu keeps approving new settlements, and there's no end to that, which makes, I mean, when I was talking about, we didn't mention it, but a person like Chomsky would probably, I'm not sure if he would still support two-state solution, but it's the idea of them taking all those settlements out of West Bank, is just, it's increasingly impossible. Which is an oxymoron. It's already impossible, but it's increasingly impossible. And
no, and I think you ended on a bleak note, so I think hopefully I could end on a more positive note. Is that sometimes I think when things are the bleakest, which were in South Korea, was just a few months ago. Do you remember how bleak things were when Trump and Kim Jong-un were throwing around crazy tweets? But sometimes in the bleakest moments, like your radical shift in how you approach things, in the sense of Moon Jae-in, where instead of holding up a gun, he held up a phone to talk to Kim Jong-un. And sometimes in the bleakest moments, just talking to each other can be the most radical thing that can change.
I think so, and I think the most radical decision is to actually discuss peace. I mean, I think the media was really lacking in that. I really do feel that, because I feel it was emotionally driven. It possessed a lot of scruples instead of like talking about the peace, and I think it's important more than ever, because as you said, when it's this bleak, maybe there's going to be like a light at the end of the tunnel.
Who knows,
Well,
and peace is a very radical thing. Like I said in the beginning, peace is not about living separately; it's about living with each other.
Do you think it's right that when I said that the political spectrum like really seriously shifted to the right, because this discussion is like tabooed at this point?
I think it's shifted very much to the right. I mean, and you just see this just in American politics itself, right? And so I mean,
so I think we have to sort of debunk this prejudice. There's nothing extremist about talking about peace, really.
No, there isn't, and and it comes with recognizing, and that's the thing, is it's in many ways it's pre-fact in the sense, I don't know if the right so when you enter a debate about facts with other people, you're entering it already from a certain perspective of Israelis are this way and Palestinians are this way, right? And that's important too, but I think the more radical thing that really needed is to just talk to each other as human beings. And when you recognize each other as human beings, even when you enter those debates of facts, I think the way you talk to each other is going to change, because now you're dealing with someone you live with, someone who's a human being. I think things will change even when you enter the actual historical sufferings that happened. I think you'll have to talk to that person. Like, that's kind of how family works, right? like family fucks you up a lot,
Yeah.
but you still got to deal with them, and you don't talk about the shit they did as the shit a stranger did, right? So I think that's kind of
Yeah, I think we should
Yeah.
talk about peace while while holding Levinas's book in one hand and really get to know the other, right?
yeah.
Well,
should.
thank you,
We
Alfred,
should.
so much for this amazing
Thank
discussion.
you.
I really had great. Just it's fun and it was really enlightening to me. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had a lot of fun too.